Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the College of the Holy Cross. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you today and to be able to help present today's event in collaboration with the Cantor Art Gallery and my colleague Meredith Fluke. One of the great joys of working at Holy Cross is the opportunity to learn from and collaborate with so many great colleagues. And I've been excited to see the energy and the intelligence that a relatively new colleague, Meredith, who is the director of the Cantor Art Gallery, is bringing to that role. When she proposed with Professor Ellen Perry that we jointly invite today's speaker in conjunction with the current visually compelling Cantor Gallery exhibition, Kevork Murad, Memory Gates, we knew that we had a great opportunity. Today's topic, the destruction of images, and images of their destruction, which looks at the power of religious and cultural images and the politics of iconoclasm, is certainly germane to the McFarland Center's mission, and I'm excited about learning more. I will turn things over to Meredith, who will introduce and welcome our speaker, Erin Tugendhaft. Meredith?
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. As Tom said, I'm Meredith Fluke, the director of the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Gallery at the College of the Holy Cross, and we're co-sponsoring this event with the McFarland Center. The event is also supported by the Department of Classics here at Holy Cross, and I welcome my colleague Ellen Perry, Professor of Classics, who will join us in conversation toward the end of the program. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Erin Tugendhaft, just a brief note on format. For the first 30 minutes or so, Dr. Tugendhaft will present on the destruction of images and images of their destruction. After that, we'll open the floor to questions and comments, which will be moderated by Professor Perry and myself. You are welcome to submit questions via the Q&A function here in Zoom, and we'll monitor vigilantly and hope that we can encourage some lively discussion today. So I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Erin Tugendhaft. Dr. Tugendhaft joins us this afternoon, which is actually really tonight for him, quite late, from Berlin, where he teaches in the humanities program at Bard College, Berlin. Previous to this post, Erin has held a number of prestigious appointments as a collegiate assistant professor of humanities at the University of Chicago, as a fellow at the Max Planck Institute, just to name two. There are many. He holds a PhD in Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies from NYU and a master's from the Committee on Social Thought from the University of Chicago, as well as specialized training in all sorts of things, including religious studies, philosophy, art history, and the study of several ancient languages, including Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ugaritic, and I put those in there for our classic students today. He threatened to give tonight's talk in ancient Sumerian, which we nixed. We're going to do it in English today. Dr. Tugendhaft's publications are equally wide-ranging in subject, from Ugaritic literature, and especially the Baal cycle, notably a recent article, Ugaritic Literature in the Hittite Empire, which was published in 2017 in the Journal of the History of Political Thought, and his 2018 book, Baal and the Politics of Poetry, to a long history of engaging with the topics of idolatry and iconoclasm, explored through several articles, and an edited volume entitled Idol Anxiety that took its name from a concept, an exhibition that Dr. Tugendhaft curated at the Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago in 2008. And I put that in there to underline some museum experience that Dr. Tugendhaft has. Somewhat heroically, Dr. Tugendhaft, and I'm going to switch to Erin and just say we've known each other for a while, so it's hard for me to call him that. So Erin has managed to marshal his different interests into a remarkable new book entitled Idols of Isis from Assyria to the Internet, published in 2020, which addresses much of the material that he will talk about today. As I began conceptualizing the work of Kevork Murad, who is the artist that we've had in residence at the Cantor Art Gallery these past few weeks, and we just opened his exhibition, I kept returning to Erin's book. Although the media and goals are quite different between the two, I found that Kevork and Erin's work kept bumping up against one another in interesting ways, especially ideas about contextualizing and recontextualizing ancient artworks, the politics of their meaning, and also ideas about cosmopolitanism and its limitations. The starting point for both Aaron and Cavork's work was the very shocking destruction of historic objects and monuments by ISIS. Cavork was born in Qamishli, Syria, which is about 3 hours northwest of Mosul, which is where Aaron's book begins, and grew up in Aleppo, which was an area devastated by war. So Aaron and Cavork's shared origination made me feel like there could be something really interesting to be gained from putting Cavork's work in dialogue with Aaron's, and then also to borrow a metaphor that Aaron uses in his book to tap them against one another. And then at the same time, I'm just delighted to talk more with Aaron about his work. So welcome, Aaron. Thank you for joining us today and for agreeing to speak to us on the destruction of images and images of their destruction.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to the McFarland Center and the Cantor Art Gallery for having me here. And thank you, Ellen, for also participating in this. One thing that Meredith did not mention about my time at the Smart Museum is that she was my boss there quite a few years ago, which is how we first got to know each other. And so it's really wonderful to be reconnecting to you with you at Holy Cross in this way. So to get started, I'm going to share my screen, and let's hope this works properly. Okay. So as many of you may remember, on February 26, 2015, the Islamic State released a video onto the internet of men smashing a number of sculptures in the Mosul Museum in Iraq. And when this video came out, actually that day, it happened to be one of those weird days where I wasn't actually on social media all day. I was in New York, and some friends, some former students of mine from Munich were visiting. And so I actually, was doing that old fashioned thing of just hanging out with people and talking to them. And we actually all went to a lecture at the end of that day at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World in New York to hear a lecture about ancient Mesopotamian sculpture, for that matter. And at the end of the lecture, one of the questioners asked, what was to be done about what's been going on in Iraq. And it's then that I sort of backed away and went into the corner of the room and looked at my phone and checked Facebook for the first time that day. And I saw this video posted numerous times on my feed. Numerous times, I say, partly because it was going viral, but I think in particular also it's worth noting already here that I saw it many times because of the fact that I am an ancient Near Eastern scholar and had many friends who were, Facebook friends who were ancient Near Eastern scholars. And so the algorithms were determining that I would care about this video. And well, they were right. And so I started thinking about the video, and pretty soon into, thinking about it, pretty soon after that initial shock and anger that I think many of us experienced wore off, I noticed an uncanny parallel. An uncanny parallel between one moment in the video, seen here on the left, of three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king, and an image that I knew from ancient Assyria, also of three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king, both sculptures lying horizontally on the ground, each even with the same style of conical headdress. Now, the image on the right is a drawing of an ancient Assyrian palace relief. I knew about this image actually because I had chosen it for the cover of the anthology of essays that Meredith mentioned a minute ago, Idle Anxiety. And so I knew of this image. It's from the palace of Sargon II, one of the Neo-Assyrian kings, his palace at Khorsabad. And Khorsabad is located about 25 kilometers away from Mosul. And so here we had two images separated by roughly 2,500 years, and yet only 25 kilometers. And basically, this was my starting point for thinking. What was going on here? What is it about this connection between these images that we could start thinking about? Why this incessant desire or impulse to destroy images? But also note that we're looking right now at two images, right? So not only the impulse to destroy images, but the impulse to make images of that destruction. So to make images of image destruction. And that was really the key question that I decided that I wanted to think a bit more about. Now, at the same time, the project that resulted in this recent book that Meredith mentioned, The Idols of Isis, also had a personal element for me. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in Baghdad in 1910 to a Jewish community that had lived by the Tigris since most likely the first exile in antiquity. And he was a member of a vibrant intellectual community at the beginning of the 20th century that was dedicated to forming this new state when Iraq became an independent nation in 1929. It was an incredibly cosmopolitan place, especially Baghdad, with Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, Christians, Jews, Yazidis, atheists, good old Marxists, everyone very mixed environment that my grandfather grew up in, on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is represented by the image on the right, he also lived through the Farhud, which was a pogrom against Jews in June 1941, which precipitated his exodus from Baghdad. And he moved this family to Tehran in Iran, which is where my mother was born. And eventually then he took his family to Tel Aviv, and from Tel Aviv to New York, which is where my mother grew up and which is where I was born and grew up. And so there was this element, this personal element in thinking about the events that were taking place in 2015 in Iraq and how they connected to my own family story. Now, these two images are from slightly earlier. These are color-coded images of Baghdad from before 2006 and then after 2006. And so these are images that really are about the results, the implications of the American-led invasion of Iraq, and how these yellow areas, which were Sunni Shia mixed neighborhoods in 2006 and earlier on the left, you can see how the yellow areas really start to diminish afterwards, all right? And that you end up getting neighborhoods that are much more polarized, or the city becomes more polarized into neighborhoods that are much more homogenized, right? And this was something that was going on already in Baghdad. And my feeling was that this was a continuation, in a sense, of what had happened to the Jews in Iraq earlier on, and that my own family was connected to, and continuing up through the horrific events of ISIS rampaging through northern Iraq, terrorizing minority communities, either forcing them to flee or worse. And so what you got was a continuous kind of homogenization that is really the second theme of this work, which is how do we sustain plurality? Hannah Arendt talks about plurality as actually a necessity for political life. And so here we see this impulse to homogenize, to flee the complications of living among people who are different from us, and flee into these homogenized spaces, which makes, again, according to Hannah Arendt, real politics impossible. And so I wanted to think about these two issues together: iconoclasm and the images of image destruction on the one hand, and what it requires to actually achieve plurality and thereby real political life. And this was also very connected to what ISIS itself was saying at the time. So right around the time that the video from the Mosul Museum was released, ISIS in its magazine Dabik published an article called "The Extinction of the Gray Zone," right? And the gray zone is the term that ISIS was using to designate this sort of mixed space where it wasn't entirely clear what your allegiance was. And the idea was that the gray zone, their actions were meant to eradicate the gray zone in order to divide the world into two very clearly distinguished camps, right? One, the camp of the believers, and one, the camp of the apostates, with nothing in between, no space in between. And so in that sense, no space for that kind of plurality, that allows for politics again, according to Hannah Arendt. And so this was another piece of what was going on, and what I think we need to struggle with. And as you'll see by the end of the presentation that I have prepared for this evening, I don't think that this is a situation that is unique to ISIS or to Iraq, but rather I want to use this as a way for us to think about the larger questions involved in both iconoclasm and in the problems of political plurality more generally. So to bring things back now to images and their destruction. On the left, this is a famous painting by Poussin representing the worship of the golden calf, the famous story from the Hebrew Bible, from Exodus 32, right? And what we see in this image, if you're not familiar with it, right, in the center in white is the priest Aaron, who is responsible for making this calf, pointing up to it. And then if you can see in the dark on the left in the background, you have a figure of Moses holding up the tablets on stone of the commandments, and presumably about to cast them down onto the ground and smash them, right? And in the story, I mean, in Exodus, Moses will eventually confront Aaron and ask him sort of, why have you done this? What have you done? And Aaron has an interesting line in that story. He says, I took the gold and I cast it into the fire, and out came this calf. And I think it's really interesting that he denies agency in this statement, right? It's that just the calf came out. And I think one of the things that I wanted to point out here, right, is in thinking about problems of idolatry and therefore some of the impetus perhaps behind certain forms of iconoclasm, not all, but at least certain important forms of iconoclasm, is an anxiety about the human manufacture of our images, of the images that we orient ourselves around. Not like, so here it's very much like in a kind of traditional worship such situation, but in my work, I think I want to think about images as not simply as ones that one worships, but rather and here the Semitic in Hebrew and Arabic, the Semitic word is the same. One serves, and therefore to serve is also a political term. And so the images that we use to kind of give our political community some orientation and make sense of our lives, and certainly I think we're all familiar with with tensions around political images today. And so I think we can really understand how these two things are not as distinct as one might initially think, right? Religion and politics are not so as distinct as we might originally think. And so one idea is that the anxiety of human manufacture. And so if you don't claim, if you deny the human origin, well, then that image can be something that we can sort of follow. Whereas if we recognize the fact that we made it, it becomes something that doesn't seem like it is worthy of us to follow, right? That somehow it's so that you want to distance it. Now, Moses, of course, has none of this, right? And he takes the calf and melts it down. You get the sense that it's not simply a question of attribution. If Moses had, if Aaron had admitted it, that he had made it, Moses would still have wanted to melt it down, because Moses seems to be aiming at something else, a kind of pure relationship to the truth, which is here in this case the divine truth, with no kind of mediation, with especially no human mediation, so that you have direct access to the truth. And it's on that point that I want to briefly just mention this opera that if you see in the image on the right, Schoenberg's rendition of this story in his opera Moses and Aaron, because it's at that moment in the story that Aaron responds to Moses, well, that's not possible. It's not possible to live without images. It's not possible to live in relationship to the pure God or unmediated truth, right? And just look at yourself, Moses. This is Aaron says, the fact that you're attacking me for this calf. Well, the melting down of this calf that you did in order to give the people some type of understanding. And the tablets that you're holding, they too are an image, right? This image of the law. And it's at that point that Moses smashes them down, and Aaron says, haha, the very smashing of those images is itself an image, right? And that you cannot escape it. And at that point, Moses basically breaks down completely. And though the opera continues, Schoenberg actually never composed beyond that moment in the opera, which I think is somewhat telling. He wrote the libretto too. He wrote the section in which Moses somehow comes out of this quandary, but he never set it to music. Okay, so what have we got in here? We have this idea of the anxiety around images, and yet that at the same time, a kind of inability to escape them, and the very fact that destroying them doesn't so much get rid of them, but produces new images, right? And here we have a couple of other examples of this from history, right? Of images of image destruction. So the main image here by Hoffenberg of the Belderstern in the 16th century in Antwerp. This is during the Protestant Reformation, and we can see people with ropes pulling down statues from a church in order to smash them, right? But again, we see this image, right? So very often we might see books on Protestant iconoclasm, and you see this image as if it were just a kind of document of the fact that images were being torn down. But of course, this is not just a document of the fact, this is itself an image of that image destruction. And so the old images, here in this case, these saints that are, these statues that are these saints above the columns, right? These old images get recycled into a new image. And something similar is happening with the images on the right, on the top, the very famous removal of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad during the Iraq War. This one famous not because of the pulling down of the statue. Actually, plenty of statues were pulled down Saddam Hussein throughout Iraq in this period. This particular one was famous because it was caught on television with a live feed, and the whole world was watching. And then on the next day, many newspapers published this image, and it got reproduced and reproduced. And so what was central there was the image of that the image of image destruction. And I think that one can say something similar about a lot of what was going on the last summer and in other times with respect to, say, the removal of Confederate statues and other such monuments. The example on the bottom right. Right, the removal it's not so much the removal, but the production of the image that can then be circulated, especially now in our in our digital media situation, which I will say a bit more about in a minute. Now, of course, in this connection, and I share these partly because I think that they're quite wonderful. These are three cartoons that were submitted to an international cartoon competition that was hosted by the government of Iran several years ago, and a lot of the cartoons were about Daesh or ISIS, Daesh. And here we have a number that really highlight the media savvy of the Islamic State. And I mean, this is something I think that we all are familiar with, and we remember from the many videos that were circulating, especially back in 2015 and 2015 or so. And I mean, I should have mentioned, right, remember that the video with which I started was not, again, also not just some document of what happened, whatever that means, but it was sophisticatedly edited, and it was given a soundtrack, and there were sections that were in slow motion. There was a opening frame with a man speaking as if he were a docent, right? Talk about museums. And so likewise here we have, just to run through them, right, on the left, image of a Daesh fighter getting a star on, what is it? Hollywood Boulevard, is that the name in LA? Yeah. There's some details there also for what it's worth, right? It seems that he's been driven by the Saudis, and he's being protected by an Israeli soldier. That tells you a little bit about the politics in Iran. But anyway, then in the middle, right, everything is highly staged, right? So they're prepared for it being shown. And then in a way, my favorite, or the one that's I think most relevant to what I want to say in a minute, right? We have two ISIS fighters, one with a scimitar sword and the other with a bloodied Facebook F, right? And so this question of which is the real weapon, right? Or what is the relationship between these two weapons? Certainly the Facebook F central to the kind of weaponry that ISIS was yielding. And so shortly after the Mosul Museum video was released, another video came out, this one at the site of Nimrud. It's one of the sites of another one of the ancient Assyrian palaces. And here on the left is a still from the video where you see barrel bombs placed next to these ancient relief sculptures, right? And then later in the video, you see the explosion of the site, right? And then on the right here, I have a screenshot from my own Facebook page, right? And so suddenly you see the image on Facebook. And I really want to say, just if we think about that Hochenberg, right, of how the old image becomes kind of now a part of the new image, right? So here we have the old palace reliefs, which, and I'll have something I can say more about this maybe in the talk or in conversation, right? The way that ancient Assyrian palace reliefs themselves function politically, right? So this was a form of political imagery that then gets embedded into a new political image, right? Into this video. But now, rather than the new images sort of being on the walls of palaces as the old ones are, they are on a new kind of wall, right? Or what used to be called a Facebook wall. I think that they, that was what it was called years ago, for those of you who remember, right? But think about it as a wall, right? And what I think one can say here is that just as the ancient Assyrians built their palaces and decorated them with these politically charged images, Isis too was building a palace, but rather than building it in stone in a physical place, they were building it in video on the internet. And so we can think of this as a virtual palace built, accessible basically anywhere that we look at our screens, right? So basically it's everywhere and nowhere. And by virtual palace, I mean, just as the ancient Assyrian palace had a range of images, like that image of people smashing the sculpture, which I'm going to come back to in a second, but likewise many other kinds of images, including wars and decapitations, as well as the kings doing the hunts and wonderful things. Isis was likewise releasing many images of image destruction, images of the decapitation images that I think you probably remember or don't want to remember, and likewise images that where you could follow them around and see how good the healthcare service was in ISIS-controlled areas, and all of those images kind of constituted together what I want to call the virtual palace, which and we'll can say more about this, but remember, we see the virtual palace on our screens, but the screens themselves, why do we see them? We have to remember, and we'll come back to this, that the screens are governed by algorithms, right? And so it's going to be now the algorithms that know our tastes that are going to decide when we get to see ISIS's virtual palace or not. Here are just a few things to say about the ancient. So you can see here, right in the center, towards the bottom, is the segment with the three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of the king. I showed you that highlight segment earlier, right? But now you see it more within the context. And what I was saying, right, like all of these images, even the Hohenberg engraving, right, originally circulated among many other engravings that had nothing to do with iconoclasm. And so very often images of iconoclasm, right, this images of image destruction, they circulate among other images, and they need to be sort of understood as part of a larger context. And so in the case here, that larger context is, first of all, the immediate context of this section with the people smashing the sculpture, but then also eventually, if one wants to really understand it, one would have to think about the iconography of the palace more generally, right? But let's just focus here. Can learn a couple of things. So this is in the context of the sacking of a city in Urartu, just sort of north of what's now probably Armenia. And right above the three figures with the sledgehammers, we have two figures with a scale, right? This very big scale, and you see the pans there. And it seems what they're doing, right, is that they are weighing the booty. They're weighing the metal that's being accumulated from the sacked city. And this has led scholars to suggest that what's going on underneath is not simply the destruction of the image of a king, but the breaking down of that image into its raw material, into its precious raw material of precious metals, right? And so what you have, right, is depicted here is what would be a movement from, well, we not see it here, but imagine the king's image in its proper or initial presentation, the way that the king would have wanted it to be presented, right? Then that image being broken down, right? And then the material of that turned into just, weighed and turned into raw material. Some of it you can see people are sort of sacking, taking it. This stuff is probably also a sign that this stuff was going to be used to then build the Assyrian palace. So there's a kind of reflexive element in the image too, right? That this palace that we're seeing was built by the material that was taken from statues like this king, for example. Yes, you understand. And then finally, just to point out slightly to the right, I don't know if you see my pointer, but right over here, sort of center right, you have three figures, one sitting down, and then one with sort of what looks like a chopstick, right? That's stylus for writing in cuneiform, and the figure right behind has a piece of parchment. And so this is a cuneiform scribe and an Aramaic scribe. These are palace bureaucrats, accountants, and they are likely documenting, right, keeping track of the resources that have been accumulated. And so in a sense, what we have here is a transition of an image into precious raw materials. And then that precious raw materials, by means of these bureaucrats, is being transformed into data, right? And so we get, in this image, we see the datafication of the image of a king. And I remind you of this because I think it's actually not all that different than what, here just to go back, right? What engaging with this image on Facebook accomplishes. Right? Because every time that I or somebody else clicks or likes or shares this image on Facebook, we produce data and wealth for the owners of the platform. Not so unlike what we see going on here in this ancient Assyrian section. So with that in mind, I just have one final image to share in order to maybe bring the situation a little bit out of Iraq. And so this image is just taken from a project that the Wall Street Journal was doing quite a few years ago. It's now defunct, called Blue Feed, Red Feed. And the idea was to try and track and see what people on the political left, what their social media screens look like, and what people on the right were seeing in their social media screens, and how, in a sense, to the extent that more and more we experience our world through our screens, depending on where you fall in the political spectrum, which and how does your computer know this? Really what that means is, depending on your habits in clicking, right? Depending on your clicking habits, what you will see on your screen, and therefore how you will experience the world, will look incredibly different. And one might think back to that image I showed earlier on of the homogenization of Baghdad into distinctly Shia and Sunni communities, right? We have something similar going on here. We all know this in a sense, right? We've all spoken about echo chambers and the like, right? And to tie this all together, though, I want to share a certain concept, which I want to share with you, right? Which I call algorithmic iconoclasm. And so if iconoclasm in a deep sense is about trying to empty our space or our world of images that offend us, or that we don't want, that we find problematic, or we find inappropriate for orienting our lives, right? Well, each of us, as we click on our social media, engage in a form of iconoclasm, because the more we tell the algorithms what we want to see, the more we ensure that we will not see what we don't want to see. And so in this regard, I think it's important to recognize that there is a form of iconoclasm that that can take place without a hammer. And in our day today, in our age today, it actually might be the most pernicious kind. And so with that, I think I'll close, and hopefully I know that there were a lot of questions and conversation with Ellen and Meredith. And so I think let me stop sharing and we can move on to conversation.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I want to just start by encouraging those of you out there to read this little book, because it's, Aaron's just touching on some of the concepts in it, but what it's really doing is weaving through all of these different ideas, sort of from the past to the present, to the future, about what it means to live with and destroy images. Aaron, I was just wondering if you could, just to start us off, talk a little bit about what you understand to be the sort of impetus behind, what ISIS was doing. I see some difference between, going to the museum and destroying images and going to, a historic site and destroying images. I don't know if that's something that that strikes you as well. But just to kind of orient us, what were the goals as you understand them behind the destruction, and then the videos of that destruction?
Okay. Well, wow. So
sorry.
No, it's fine. It's just I thought that I thought that I was by this point I had escaped this question. So I can address it a little bit, but I'm going to just share with you an anecdote first, if I may, right? Which is that very early on in this project, I was invited to give this talk, very early version of this work at a number of places, and one of those places was West Point, and I gave the talk, and immediately after the talk, all of the cadets, all they wanted to know is, what is it? Why is ISIS doing it? What do they want? How do we stop them, right? And I quickly realized that, well, two things. First of all, I didn't have an answer to that question, and there were other people who were better at answering it, right? And it also wasn't really necessarily. It also helped me understand that it wasn't ultimately the less now you've had, so I don't know if if you're a cadet in disguise, but
I am.
Yeah.
No, I think just to
Sure.
the
Yeah.
audience, just very quickly, you have a whole chapter about
Absolutely.
this.
Right. So that's what I was going to say. Right. So thank you. And I didn't mean to skirt the question entirely, but so the second chapter of the book, which in a way I don't think I really said much, and much of what I just presented, really none of it comes from the second chapter, and so maybe it is worth saying a word or two about that, which happens to be the longest chapter, and it's a chapter called Museums, and so in that sense, it's asking the question of like what's the significance of the fact that this video was filmed and these actions were taken within a museum, which in a way raises the larger question for me, and this is what I really pursue in the chapter, which is what different meanings, and I emphasize here different, right? It's not there is not just one essential meaning to ancient Near Eastern sculpture, but rather since their rediscovery in the 19th century, and their placement in museums and in other places, and their reproduction in different forms, they've been attributed multiple different meanings, whether it's in a museum like the Louvre or the British Museum, or museums in Iraq. Even in Iraq, frankly, there are different meanings between the significance of a place like the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and a more quote unquote peripheral museum like the Mosul Museum. And so that whole chapter sure really goes into all of this. That said, so to answer your question, I mean, one of the things that I think has to be said, right, is that there is a linkage between the ideas. Well, but again, it's complicated. I think different people are going to want to choose different choose one of these options based on their politics. And I emphatically want to try and put as many of them on there as possible and sort of not allow that easy answer. So some people are going to say, well, the museum is a Western institution, and so a museum in Iraq is an aspect of colonial imposition on Iraq, and then therefore to attack the museum is to attack Western colonialism. And to which I would say true. At the same time, the regime of Saddam Hussein was perhaps one of the most ancient Iraqi images, and Saddam loved these images. He spent tremendous amounts of money, refurbishing museums like the Mosul Museum. But it got to but he did so in such a way that it was never unlinked with his own personality, to the point that when rebuilding the walls of Babylon, he had bricks cast in cuneiform stating, this was built by Saddam Hussein in the manner of the ancients. And so this itself also left a trauma, and a kind of a desire to reject that as material that's seen as Saddam propaganda. Of course, this gets into this. Here we can get into the question of where are these these particular ISIS fighters from? Are they even Iraqi, Are they doing it are they even doing it for either of those reasons, or they're just doing it because they want to get the media attention, or they're doing it for religious reasons? I think it's a huge mixture of things that I don't feel confident to choose just one.
Nobody should. I just wanted to hear you say it and talk a little bit about it. There's so many questions, Erin. I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to.
Yeah, our questions are piling up here, and I'm going to combine a number of them because a number of them seem to be about how is the situation right now different from the way it's been in the past in terms of destruction of art, with particular emphasis on questions like, does the fact that it's a video give it more impact than if it's a still image? Does the fact that you can watch it over and over and over give it more impact? And then again, the ISIS video includes things like music, So do all of those things kind of heighten the emotion in the current situation relative to past examples?
Yeah. So I'd be curious to know what Meredith thinks also, because Meredith is great, and you, Ellen, as well, I think that it's a great question, and it's really worth thinking about. It's largely a question about the impactful nature of the arts and visual arts, and whether are our arts today, because of technology, more moving, Like we talk about moving images. Does that mean that are moving images do they move us more than medieval sculpture, Meredith? Or not? I think that, and I think everyone knows this, And I think even the generation younger than me certainly knows this, That we're becoming more and more a visual culture, And I think that and so I think so. Yes. So I think my short answer, would be yes. Maybe just an addition to that. But again, I'd love to hear what the others think. We think about some of these images, whether it's an ISIS video or really just a post on Instagram, or a TikTok video. We think of these things as ephemeral. And therefore, we might think of them as not particularly powerful because they're ephemeral. And I think that that's a mistake. I think that it's a mistake to think that because something is ephemeral, it's not powerful. Partly because of just the one thing might be ephemeral, but the amount of bombardment of it makes up for it in a certain sense. I haven't thought enough about this at all, but I think that that's a mistake, and that's why the one thing I would say there is that I think it's interesting in relationship, for example, to some of the debates about public monuments in squares, especially during a pandemic when most of us aren't even going into squares. I think that the ephemeral images that we see on our screens have much more of an impact about the formation of ourselves as political actors and form our political identity, I think, than any sculpture in a park. That you shouldn't take that as a statement as to what a position should be about judgments about keeping or removing sculptures in the park. It's just a point about trying to get us to realize that actually, if we're going to really be thinking about the impact of images on our lives, it's on our screens that I think the most impact is to be had these days.
Interesting. And then there are a couple of questions here that are asking after your personal connection to this whole thing. One of them from the point of view of, since your family comes from this area, does it all have more of an impact on you than it might on other people? And then the other one, I'll just read out word for word. Given your position as an ancient Near East scholar, how would you describe your emotional responses to the journey of these images being destroyed? Your responses before they were destroyed, the moment you saw them being destroyed, and the images post-destroyed. So those kind of what your personal reaction is.
Positionality questions. Okay, so I'm gonna disappoint because I'm not going to answer either of those questions the way that I'm expected to, right? With respect to the first one, the truth is this was more of an opportunity for me to get in touch with that history and that my heritage than a situation where that heritage was already well formed and therefore I reacted to my first experience of the image by means of a kind of well-formed identity. I'll just share that. I mean, even my Iraqi heritage, in a certain sense, was muddled by the fact that I think I mentioned there was a brief sojourn of the family in Iran, which, for whatever reason, whether it's because basically that was what had more of an influence on me as a child, just for what it's worth, because we tended to go to a Persian restaurant once a week, and so I grew up with Persian food and not Iraqi food. I don't know whether that's because Persian food's better, or we liked Persian food more, or just New York didn't really have Iraqi restaurants available at the time. Whatever it was, that was, so this was, anyway, I don't have to go into all of that. The point is simply that this really gave me an opportunity to learn a lot more into the ancient stuff, which I was a scholar of, but I didn't really identify so much as like from the place. And that was a great experience for me. And I encourage people to learn, to do stuff like that. But it also means that, I'm also recognized that I've never been to Iraq. I have not suffered from the recent events, whether it's Saddam's regime or the Iraq War or all of the events since then. And so I want to maintain a very modest claim on Iraq. I think that I have, some claim to calling myself Iraqi and connection to the situation, but I think that it's important to have a balance there. As an ancient Near Eastern scholar, I can't say that I was happy about the destruction of the objects, but I also found there was a certain kind of, what's the right word? I don't know if I'm going to find the right word, so I'll just say that when hearing about the responses by a number of my colleagues and especially the institutional responses to the events, they left me a little bit, left a little unpleasant taste in my mouth. Let me put it that way. And I think that I go into this a little bit, as Meredith I think knows in the right in the second chapter, and so I think complicated, right? I didn't want to move I didn't want to let the video, and I think, let me put it this way. I think the video wanted to shock me into a knee-jerk reaction that was going to throw me into one end of a spectrum. And this is I think, connected to that idea of eradicating the gray zone, right? So the image, the video is intended to polarize. And this video is definitely intended for a Western audience that they know are going to see this and they're going to get all up in arms and they're going to run much further in the direction of, this is the worst thing in the world. How can these barbarians be doing this? And I wanted to resist that move, partly because I don't think that it's the right move to make, and partly because I knew I was being baited, and I didn't want to allow myself to be baited. And I think that it paid off, because I think that it allows you to actually think about the situation far better if you can avoid being baited in that way.
That's a question that was coming up among my students a lot last week when we were talking about ISIS. They're wondering whether we're feeding it by reacting, and whether we should, where do we say it's okay to talk now about it, but we shouldn't talk right when it happens, or where do you find the right place to say, okay, now we can talk about it because we're not feeding the beast.
And you were feeding Mark Zuckerberg, but that, right, because that's the point, right? It didn't matter, right? Like in that respect, right? It didn't matter whether you were clicking and sharing because you thought this was a great video, or you were clicking and sharing because you thought it was an awful video. To the data miners, it is just, cha-ching, cash in the bank. But that's, I think that these are large questions that we're going to have to deal with, and we're at least there are some conversations starting in that regard.
And oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I have a question that's sort of back a little bit, but there's a question here that's would you say that the acts of iconoclasm conducted by ISIS are felt more politically than ancient images of image destruction? And I'm going to add to that, because of the development of digital media. And I think, one thing that seems important to me here is talking about power differentials and, who it is. And so that's, that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of go back to this idea of like why ISIS why ancient Mesopotamian sculpture, right? Like, what is it about that is worth destroying? And I'm just also going to put on my art historian hat and say, physical objects have a different capacity, right? They're existing over long periods of time. And unlike a video, which I will say, I understand the sort of idea about ephemera, but at the same time, physical objects inhabit the space that we're in. They're not on a flat screen. They don't move around. And so they're sort of able to be there for us to pin, different ideas over time too. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to put that in there, but also, is there a difference between, this sort of destruction by a ruling force in order to clear out some of the opposition imagery versus, what ISIS is doing as sort of a moment of shock against, what we see to be cultural heritage, right? Like that was, part of the issue is that these things, they've been around for a really long time. This whole Mesopotamian cradle of history issue, that was part of the shock that museums were then reacting to. Is these are old things, right. We might understand as being part of our sort of larger human cultural history. And I know you have a lot to say about that, but can we really say that this is the same thing?
Okay, so first of all, I never want to say two things are the same thing, right? So the key of comparison, right, is I remember learning from Jonathan Z. Smith, right, is that comparison is never between two terms; it's always two terms with respect to a third, right? So you're always it's the what's rich about comparison, right? Is if they were the same thing, then there would be nothing to compare, right? So. So that's not, the question is whether by thinking about them together, we can generate interesting and more complex thoughts. So, you shared a lot there, and I'll try and respond to a little bit of it. So first of all, remember ISIS is the Islamic State, right? So the claim was that they are a state, and at their height, and again, of course, what exactly it means to control what it meant really for them to control territory, though frankly, also in antiquity, what what it meant for an ancient empire to control territory is an interesting question. I mean, that's always a question, right? What does it mean to actually control territory? It's not really just put a line on a map doesn't mean that you actually control it necessarily. But that said, I mean, at their height, interestingly, right, the extent of the Islamic State was roughly the extent of the Middle Assyrian Empire, or the early period of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which, by the way, is a much more natural, quote unquote, for the geography, state formation in the area than the deeply unnatural divide between, with the line in the sand between Iraq and Syria that was imposed by the Sykes-Picot Treaty, right? And so there is some interesting things that one could say about that. I don't think it was just for nothing that there's such an overlap between, if you opened your ancient Near Eastern textbook and looked at the early period of the Neo-Assyrian period, and you looked at an ISIS map, but okay. So in that sense, they're destroying the images, the political images of their opponents, not differently than the Assyrian king destroying or showing the images of the Urartian king being destroyed. So I think that there is a similarity there. But of course, all of these images are so multivalent, right? Polyvalent, right? Or they're like levels and levels of signification. So it depends on what we think about. So right. So are these the images of the colonial oppressor, right? And is that the political enemy? Are they the images of Saddam Hussein? Or these are we were talking about? And now you brought up, right, this question of like universal heritage, right? And I think, I can share a story that I relate in the book. Let me see if I can even find it. See if it's for a second to read it. It's such a good story. Do I have a minute? I'll read this passage, right? So, poet and novelist Victor Hugo. For the celebration of Victor Hugo's Jubilee, a grand reception was organized at the Élysée Palace, to which representatives of every nation came to pay their homage. The great poet took his place in the reception hall in a solemn, statuesque pose, elbow resting on the marble of a chimney. One after another, the nation's delegates came forward from the crowd and presented their homage to the master. An usher announced them in stentorian voice. "The gentleman representing England," he proclaimed, and Victor Hugo, his eyes in ecstasy, his voice shot through with dramatic tremolos, replied, "England! Ah, Shakespeare." The usher went on. "The gentleman representing Spain," Victor Hugo in the same vein, "Spain! Ah, Cervantes." The gentleman representing Germany, "Germany! Ah, Goethe." But a short man stepped forward, clumsy, chubby, of rustic bearing, and the usher announced with flair, "The gentleman representing Mesopotamia." Then Victor Hugo, who until that moment had remained impassible and sure of himself, appeared troubled. His suddenly anxious pupils cast a broad look around that seemed to embrace the universe, searching in vain for something out there. But it soon became clear to the spectators that he had found it and that he once again mastered the situation. And with the same pathetic accent, the same conviction, he answered the pudgy representative with these words, "Mesopotamia, ah, humanity." So, especially in the 19th century, and I think we continue to inherit this idea that somehow the Mesopotamia is, right, this phrase, the cradle of civilization, the source of humanity. And humanity here, right, it's noteworthy, right, that it's, as opposed to the other cases, which are nation states and therefore political entities, right? Here, somehow Mesopotamia in this European ideological formation, right, is is presented as this apolitical thing, as this pre-political thing, as this thing that unites us all before our politics and somehow therefore superior to our politics. And if we could only get back to Mesopotamia in a sense, and this is really the myth of the Tower of Babel, which was in Mesopotamia, right? If we could only get back there, right, we can get away from all of this awful fighting and infighting and that we have, all of this politics, right, such that we can reassert ourselves as a unified humanity. And since the 19th century, these objects, right, have been used for that purpose. And I think that, you know, sometimes there's something, you know, beautiful in that image, but I think that there can also be something deeply, you know, troubling and problematic in that as well.
I wonder how Western the concept of unified humanity is, in the same way that I wonder how Western the idea of the encyclopedic museum is. And we actually have somebody, we have a question here related to that. What is the obligation of museums? Striving to preserve so that in the future all may interpret a Western concept?
Right. Okay, so I have my own view on this, which again is probably not the one that I'm supposed to have. So it's chic to hate the encyclopedic museums, right, as being some kind of Western formation, and there's no question that such an institution can play such a role, right? It has played such a role in many situations. That said, I'm a kid that grew up, luckily, incredibly privileged. I grew up 2 blocks away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I spent most of my adolescence and, you know, later teenage years there working at the Met. And I loved it. And and not simply did I love it, that's not so much important, but I think that it allowed me to really experience the vast richness of what human beings have brought into being over the course of our time on this planet, or right, our cultural production on this planet. The richness, the complexity, the similarities and the differences, it made me want to try to understand that mystery, which is human beings in their complexity. And I feel incredibly privileged to have had that opportunity to be exposed one room to the next and think about, wait a second, how do you square, right, this producing this Rembrandt with these Japanese, you know, sculptures, whatever it may be. I don't think the answer is to say that that's a Western thing, and if we want to undermine the Western hegemony, we have to get rid of that. I think that what we need to say is that is a wonderful opportunity to think about what it means to be a human being, and we want as many people as possible to be able to do that. And so my answer is not, you know, so I mean, you know, again, lots of nuance here, right? There, and questions of actual theft versus whatever. But ultimately, my ultimate goal, right, without getting into the nitty gritty here, is that we have encyclopedic museums that allow for people, young people like me, to have those experiences. But we don't only have them in New York and London and Berlin and Paris and whatnot, right? But that the Iraq Museum also should be an encyclopedic museum. And so I'm more, you know, again, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of any particular object, but I'm more interested in, rather than sending back Assyrian sculptures to Iraq, where, right, send back a Turner or a Picasso, like, or, you know, the Uffizi just announced this week, right, that they're going to start putting, and which just sounds great, right? In order to prevent so many people from coming to Florence, they're going to put some of their paintings in the surrounding towns. Sounds great, right? But I read these stuff. These museums have massive amounts of storage, right? I don't know about the Cantor Gallery, Meredith. I'm not suggesting that you send stuff to Iraq, but, you know, I think that we should, I guess my view is that we should be working towards that. We should be working towards a situation where no matter where you're born, right, you should be able to have access not only to this material over the internet, right, but also to the, because of what Meredith said before, there really is, the experience of actually being with an actual physical object is a real important experience. And I mean, my ideal would be to try and figure out politically how to make that possible for as many people on this globe.
Meredith, is there time for one more?
Yes, and I think because we have so many questions about social media, that's probably the direction that question needs to go. So there's a lot of questions about social media, and I think, I'm just going to throw one out there and hope that the rest of them get answered sort of through the answering of this question. So I'm going to go with the one that is, do social media companies bear responsibility for devising algorithms that promote these images of iconoclasm that play into Daesh's strategy, or propagation of the image is inevitable given human nature's morbid fascination with such acts?
So I guess I want to separate the question, right? So on the one hand, right, we could, as the question is asking it, right, the question is, well, the fascination with like an image like Daesh's image of image destruction, right? And then, but I do want to sort of just bring back this thought that I tried to introduce at the very end, right? Which is that there's other kinds of iconoclasm, so what I'm calling iconoclasm going on too, right? That it's not that we are also being iconoclasts. We're not only being, so really there are two issues here, right? There's one, which is our fascination with iconoclasm, just as because we're fascinating with gruesome things, right? And I think that that's probably true. But then there's also this question of our complicity or our, and also the algorithms complicit, right? Our interaction with these algorithms that by which we purify our experience of the world, to the point where we purify our worlds, right? And I want to focus on, I know that this wasn't exactly the question, but I want to reiterate this just because I think that, yes, we are fascinated by the gruesome stuff. I think that human beings do have are drawn to that. I think we're all being in a situation where it seems like everybody agrees with us, or at least or where the disagreements where we have really aren't fundamental, right? And so I think that I mention that because I think that one of the real problems with algorithms and this kind of algorithmic iconoclasm is that it's so desirable, right? We don't want to, right? We have names for the people that every now and then pop up with a different opinion. We call them trolls, right? We don't want to see them. We want to be in a space, right, where they don't exist. And of course, to a certain extent, that's right. I mean, just as like private life, right? Like if I have a dinner party, I get to choose who I invite to my dinner party. But if more and more we're experiencing our full experience of the world, right, in that way, I think we have to become very, very cautious and worried about how that's transforming our experience. And then the question is, well, I think, I don't know how to do this, right? But how do we make demands on the platforms to not give in to what our clicking fingers tell them that we want, right? I mean, that's the problem. Right? Then we're getting into kind of paternalism and these types of things, right? But it's a complicated situation because they're very happy to follow with what we want because the more their algorithms follow what we want, the more money they're making, right? And so how to get out of that? I don't have a solution to that, but if I can at least try to help draw our attention to the problem, I think that's at least a start. We should be aware of what's going on.
Okay, we are so far over time right now. It's almost tomorrow in Aaron's world. We are so grateful that you came to talk about this today, Aaron. I think everyone, you've gotten the link to Aaron's book. You should take a look at it. It is wide ranging, and there's a lot about all of these issues in there that he goes into in more depth. And
it's short.
And it's also
and it's not hard to read.
And that's the point. It was written so that it would be easy for you to read. and for me to read as well. I'm obviously reading it with notes. It's something that, should be sort of fundamental for all of us to take a look at and think about all of these problems that we're discussing today. So thank you so much, Erin, for coming. Thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you to Tom and Ellen for joining me in inviting Erin to be here today. And we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you very so much. I'm so sorry that we just couldn't do this in person, and I wish that I had a chance to look at the galleries. The galleries look amazing. So if any of you who are listening have an actual opportunity to walk into the galleries, please do that on my behalf, because yes. I would love to go in there, vicariously through you. I'm not going to be able to get back to Massachusetts in time.
Yes, when it's all said and done, we'll see you here, and you can root through our storage space to see what we should send back to Iraq. All right, thank you so much.